I'm really delighted to introduce our next panel on a keyword for this roundtable and a keyword for this fourth edition on operationalizing international agreements on AI. As you know, and it's something I've seen and I'm seeing in the chat, which is quite lively, and thank you for that, and continue to post and share and react. Indeed, the AI revolution is a global revolution. And therefore, however difficult, its governance should also be global. That's something we at TFS have been deeply invested since our creation for the past 8 years. And without further ado, I'll hand over to our moderator for this session, Mr. Marc Rotenberg, the founder and director of the DC-based Center for AI and Digital Policy. We'll kick off the panel, and the panel will also include Mrs. Karine Perset, indeed head of units for AI at OECD, Mrs. Marielza Oliveira, director of partnerships and operational program monitoring at UNESCO, Mr. Jan Kleijssen, director of information society and action at the Strasbourg-based Council of Europe, which is not to be confused with the Council of the European Union here in Brussels, but I'll let our moderator, Marc, shed light on that in his introduction. Marc, the floor is yours.
To the Future Society for the organization of this timely and important event. It is a real pleasure to be with you and also to have the opportunity to moderate this discussion that looks at an issue of increasing importance for those who are studying AI policy, and that concerns the operationalization. I think that was your word, Nico. I prefer implementation. It's a bit easier for me to say. But of course, we're living now at a time where these AI policy frameworks are moving forward rapidly. And we can, for example, check the boxes for the countries that endorsed the OECD AI principles and the G20 AI guidelines back in 2019. We can also check the box for the countries that endorsed the UNESCO AI recommendation of 2021. And we're looking forward to checking future boxes for the EU AI Act and the Council of Europe AI Convention. But even as we go through the exercise of acknowledging the commitments that countries have made, we have, of course, the very interesting challenge of trying to see how we are going to implement those commitments and how we are going to measure the implementation process. And I will say that for us at the Center for AI and Digital Policy, this is a key form of our evaluation. We look both at the country commitments and we look next at the steps for implementation. So I could not be more delighted than I am to have with us leading representatives from the Council of Europe, from the OECD, and from UNESCO to tell us where we are today, moving this process forward of establishing these new AI policy frameworks and then taking the next steps toward implementation. And I'd like to begin our conversation first with Jan Kleijssen from the Council of Europe. The Council has done very important work over the last several years in support of an AI convention. You established in 2020 the CAHI, which was the group of experts, provided for you an initial framework, moved on now to the Committee on AI that has taken up the CAHI recommendation. Can you tell us a bit, Jan, about where things are at the Council of Europe and the steps ahead as we move toward a global convention on AI?
Yes, thank you very much, Marc, and good afternoon to you all. And thanks to the Athens Roundtable for providing this opportunity and for this fascinating roundtable so far. Yes, you mentioned the work of the Council of Europe. It was also addressed by the Ukrainian minister a few moments ago. Where do we stand and where this process is going? The Council of Europe, and it was already mentioned, not to be confused with the European Union, brings together 46 states. And it fosters human rights and democracy through legal cooperation, and more specifically through lawmaking. So it is not just EU standards, that concern law on AI and other technological matters, but the Council of Europe, often on a global scale, prepares conventions that then become benchmarks. I give this small introduction to set the scene, because this week another Council of Europe, the Cybercrime Convention, was joined by Brazil as the 68th state to do so, bringing together all 5 continents and many countries also from the global south, which was mentioned in the previous panel, joined this convention. So our belief was and is that in order to address technological challenges that may have a big impact on human rights, rule of law, and democracy, it is important to bring many stakeholders together, not only our member states, but also well beyond that. And therefore, as you mentioned, Mark, 2 years ago, and I'll come in a few seconds to what we do now, we indeed set up a committee to establish whether we needed further regulation on AI or whether existing law and legal frameworks were sufficient. And secondly, if the answer to the first question was affirmative, we need more, what should be the elements of a future instrument? Kai did so with, and I would like to stress this really, with initially 53 states on board, namely the then 47 of the Council of Europe, the 5 observer states of the Council of Europe, which are the United States, Mexico, Japan, Canada, and the Holy See, as well as the government of Israel, which requested to be admitted to these negotiations. Because of the Russian aggression against Ukraine, the Council of Europe expelled Russia from the organization. So we're now 52 states at the table, but also we have industry, we have 25 digital partners and civil society. And our aim is to provide by November 2023, so in a year without minus a few weeks, the first treaty to be presented to these governments, a draft treaty, to ensure that the design and development and application of AI systems will respect human rights and rule of law. And to that extent, we aim to reach agreement on a few basic principles that governments should take into account when they use AI, which governments should ensure that citizens can invoke, because the treaty is supposed to be, Council of Europe treaties are supposed to be transformed into national law, so that a number of the principles that were mentioned throughout this conference on robustness, on transparency, right data sets will indeed be guaranteed, but also very importantly, that there is a human in the loop always, a competent human in the loop, and finally, that there is a remedy available. And in order to ensure this, besides, and I'll finish here, besides the basic rights and obligations, the treaty will have an annex probably that will deal with the human rights impact assessment, an obligatory test that governments should carry out before using AI in order to ensure that its use and application cannot harm human rights, and should things go wrong, provide for an effective remedy.
That's great. Thank you so much, Jan. And thank you also for the important reminder, of course, that the Council of Europe is distinct from the Council of the European Union in composition and mandate, and also critically for consideration in the treaty domain. Treaties are open for ratification by non-member states. And we know many non-member states have ratified Council of Europe conventions. So this is an important opportunity for countries to participate in. So I'd like next to go to Karine Perset, and just begin by saying, Karine and her team at the OECD have simply done remarkable work over the last several years. Sometimes it's the case that an organization creates a policy framework and then moves on to a new topic. But I think, in fact, the OECD decided that AI was really a topic that deserved more attention since the AI principles were outlined and endorsed in 2019. So perhaps, Karine, you could bring us up to date on the recent work of the OECD and perhaps also with an eye toward implementation of the principles.
Thank you so much, Mark. And I'm delighted to participate in this important roundtable today. So in terms of next steps for implementing the AI principles, the OECD AI principles from 2019, I'll highlight one project that Andrea Renda mentioned briefly that's about international interoperability and how we manage AI risk throughout the AI system lifecycle. And what this is really about is identifying common guideposts to assess and manage AI risks by first identifying commonalities, but also differences between all the really important initiatives that are underway to manage AI risk by standard bodies, international organizations, and others. And so to do that, we're leveraging the ISO's basic framework that has 4 key stages. The first stage is really defining the AI risk context. And the starting point here is that different AI applications carry very different risks depending on the context. And to define that context and the relevant risks, we developed a framework to classify AI systems earlier this year that looks at things like what kind of data is the AI system using, what types of models, what autonomy level, and so on. All questions that are really important to the risk level and the policy ramifications of a particular type of AI system. And this information can really help us treat different AI systems differently. Second, and building on this framework, we're working on approaches to assess risk in an interoperable way with lots of national and international experts and stakeholders like NIST in the US, the ISO, IEEE, the Commission, Council of Europe, and others. And we see a real window of opportunity right now to seek interoperability. Ideally, so just this is an ideal situation. It's not at all guaranteed, but ideally ahead of laws and standards being finalized and enacted, particularly to try and use the same concepts and terminology to decrease the burden on those who will have to implement all these frameworks, particularly smaller organizations that are operating internationally, and thereby to increase the effectiveness and likelihood of success, because each of these frameworks are going to require a lot of work on the part of organizations, implementing organizations. So third, then, to treat and address risks, legislation and policy instruments are critical, but they really need to be accompanied by practical tools and particularly educational approaches in addition that also can help with those practical tools. And fourth and last, and again, I'm following this ISO's framework, which is about, the last point is really about governing AI risk. And here we really need all kinds of different governance mechanisms, including regulation standards. And one area where we're working on that we think is promising is corporate governance, where we think it could be useful to apply an existing OECD instrument that's the due diligence guidance for responsible business conduct that's associated with a tried and true enforcement mechanisms so that it covers AI principles and AI specificities. And we believe this could be one effective way to help operationalize responsible business conduct for trustworthy AI in companies of all sizes operating internationally. So that's just one project, but back to you, Mark.
That's great. Thank you, Karine. And I guess we're looking forward next week at the meeting of the Trade and Technology Council for some of that work at the OECD to help build a transatlantic bridge on the standard setting process. So thank you for that. We'll go next to Marielza Oliveira to tell us about the remarkable work of the UNESCO, not only in AI, but I guess more broadly also on digital strategy.
Thank you very much, Mark. And first of all, hello from Addis Ababa. I'm here in Ethiopia. We just wrapped up the 17th Internet Governance Forum, where actually fairness, inclusion, trust in digital spaces and technologies, and specifically artificial intelligence, were actually central concepts in the discussions that were held. So thanks for including me in this panel and for the question on the UNESCO recommendation on how it's moving forward and what else we've been doing in there. So yeah, the recommendation is the first ever global standards on the ethics of artificial intelligence. And because of that, it's being considered a historical instrument because it defines the shared values and the principles which must guide the development, the deployment, and the use of AI around the world. It includes, of course, known principles such as human oversight, privacy, fairness, transparency, and explainability, responsibility, and accountability, but also brings new principles such as proportionality to ensure that AI methods are right for the context in which they are applied and location in which they are used. So for us to manage the risks that AI is bringing, whether due to malicious use, to the fact that these technologies widen or may widen existing between and within country inequalities, threaten privacy and human agency, we really need to make these principles go beyond being words on paper to actually being completely feasible management instruments, meaningful governance mechanisms. So I'd like to bring attention to two elements of the UNESCO recommendation that make it go beyond this statement of principles. It really first contains a list of concrete policy actions that ensure the practical implementation of the ethical principles in different domains that range from data policy to education and culture across the entire artificial intelligence life cycle. And the two instruments that I use to assess whether AI is being developed in an ethical manner. The first is the ethical impact assessment to help countries and companies to develop and deploy AI in ways to assess whether the impact these systems are having on individuals, on societies, on the environment, and the readiness assessment methodology that helps member states or countries to identify where they stand in terms of legal and technical elements that are needed for trustworthy, responsible, and ethical artificial intelligence applications. So right now, we have a multi-stakeholder group of experts working to design these instruments, which we expect to see ready by the end of this year, ready for use and adoption and piloting by the beginning of 2023. Including by countries that are close supporters of their recommendation, that are forming a Friends of the Recommendation group. But in the meantime, we know that ethics is not sufficient. So UNESCO is also working in a lot of other mechanisms. The first is to raise awareness of the impacts of artificial intelligence on our societies, and a big focus of that and how they impact human rights. We are developing guidelines for the collection and use of data, which is actually the key ingredient of artificial intelligence, in ways that ensure ethics, justice, and privacy, raising awareness of the need to increase transparency and accountability in relation to deployment of these platforms and systems, building capacities of decision makers to manage the risks from these technologies, and developing the tools and instruments that guide and facilitate deployment of responsible, trustworthy, ethical AI systems. For us, the point is to ensure that AI does three things: that it preserves what we value, that it promotes what we want, and it prevents what we fear from happening. So let me stop here and we'll continue the conversation. Thank you.
That's a wonderful answer. Thank you so much. For round two, we're going to get a little bit more difficult. I'm going to push now on this issue of implementation, looking specifically at these three different domains, and come back to you again, Jan, because of course there's some concern now about the relationship between the Council of Europe's work and the European Union's work. And I will say frankly that many of us who are participating in both undertakings were disappointed by a recent decision that seemed to hit a pause button, if you will, on the work of the Council of Europe. But you have talked about the need for complementarity. You've also talked about the urgency of this international convention. And I'm hoping you can tell us a few more words about the strategy for moving forward at this point in time.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark. First, perhaps a word about the urgency. A number of use cases, a number of practical demonstrations of what can happen when the governance of AI is not as it should be, have, I think, made quite an impact over the past year. In Europe, and I know these cases happened all over the world, but in Europe, a particular tragedy shook my country, where the well-intended use by an automated decision-making system, AI system, by the tax authorities, led to thousands of people being wrongly accused of fraud with regard to child benefits. A number of people committed suicide because they were forced to pay back huge sums of money whilst they were on minimum income. It now appears last week, when I spoke at previous conferences, I mentioned 1,600 children were taken out of their families. It now appears that more than 2,000 children were taken forcibly away from their parents because these parents were, without reason, without justification, through an AI system, accused of fraud. The government fell. The president of the highest administrative tribunal had to apologize on television for miscarriage of justice. So there was it is really demonstrated what can go wrong if there is not sufficient governance of AI. And in an opinion, in an expert opinion on what happened in the Netherlands, one of the Council of Europe's leading advisory bodies, the Venice Commission, pointed out that what happened in the Netherlands could also very easily happen elsewhere, and perhaps is happening elsewhere. So hence the urgency, because it is not just administrative hassle, it can concern lives and livelihoods in a very direct manner. Now, you mentioned the European Union. The European Union Union's AI Act has, of course, been much mentioned already at the Athens Roundtable so far. It is negotiated within the European Union. It's to regulate the internal market. Is negotiated by the 27 member states of the European Union and EU institutions. The Council of Europe's efforts aim to obtain a global benchmark, to set a global benchmark on the respect for human rights, rule of law, and democracy by the use, when governments are using AI systems, and when governments, of course, allow private sector also to use AI systems when this can interfere with human rights, rule of law, and democracy. And you may then ask, but the Council of Europe is also a regional organization, bigger than the EU, but can it do so? Yes, it can. That's why I mentioned Brazil a moment ago as the 68th country to have joined the Budapest Convention against cybercrime, which really is the example we're trying to follow. Last year, the Council of Europe was active in 130 countries worldwide with capacity building. And that is something that we also very much hope we will be able to do once our hopefully global AI convention will be presented next year. And we also, as I mentioned, are already negotiating with states, not only from Europe, but also very, very important other partners. The complementarity, I think, lies also in the fact that whereas the EU efforts relate very much to the products, the Council of Europe's efforts very much relate to the process. It relates to where governments use AI, what the standards should be. And a very important other difference is that the Council of Europe Treaty will confer rights on citizens that through domestic law, they'll be able to invoke before courts. So like the right to a remedy, like the right to be informed, like the right to have access to stored systems, and also the right, as I said, to have the right to have a remedy will also mean probably that the judiciary will have to think hard on how to ensure that citizens can address courts where judges will be trained in and competent to decide on AI systems, issues relating to AI systems, the use or the abuse, if you like, or things that go wrong, very much like you have juvenile chambers and civil chambers and criminal chambers in courts, that there will also be perhaps technology or AI chambers to deal with, just as a very practical example on what this could mean.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Jan. Back to Karine at the OECD, and putting aside for just the moment the classification work and the risk analysis work, I did want to ask you over on implementation. The OECD, of course, prides itself on its evidence-based policy work. You've issued two very good reports so far on steps toward implementing the OECD AI principles. I was wondering if you could tell us a few more words about plans for future reports and how you continue to measure the steps that countries are taking to implement the 2019 AI principles.
Absolutely. The OECD is a big part of the OECD.
I'm sorry, Karine, I think you're breaking up.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me better now?
Yes, thank you.
So the OECD believes that evidence is really important to inform public policy. So I'll mention 3 projects to improve evidence for AI governance that we're working on right now. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
So first of all, to monitor AI risks, and here tying back to the previous conversation, to monitor those risks that materialize into actual AI incidents, like the case in the Netherlands that Jan just described, we're developing a reporting framework for AI incidents. And the idea here is that countries and organizations could use a similar framework to track incident trends and be able to avoid ultimately a same AI incident reoccurring elsewhere that uses the same model or whatever, the same training data set. And to support this work, we have in parallel been building a global AI incidents monitor that documents global incidents based on publicly reported information. So these are instances where AI systems caused harm and that were then the topic of public media articles or of academic publications. So they're alleged harms, so alleged incidents. They haven't gone through a judicial process, but there's a hazard there at the very least. We're tracking that in real time in all the languages in all the world, and we're also starting to track case law, which tells us about incidents that have occurred and have the added benefit of having been adjudicated. So we're just using the publicly available sources, which might be just the tip of the iceberg, but it's a starting point and to give us an idea of what's actually happening and the trends before we have, and ideally we would in the future have more complete information. The second project I wanted to mention is basically the OECD.ai Policy Observatory that we launched in early 2020, and that has a bunch of evidence and one resource on the observatory is a qualitative database of national AI policy that currently covers 69 countries and that we're looking to expand. Valuable lessons can often be learned from other countries' experience and from benchmarking. Through analyzing this data and the evidence from this data and the results, the lessons learned, the things that went well, but even more importantly, the things that didn't work, other countries can learn from that. And OECD.ai also has a whole section on worldwide AI trends to inform policies with data on what's happening in real time or quasi-real time. And what's happening is very interesting and not always what you'd expect. So just by way of example, India has become a major AI player in terms of AI skills and software development, and even on other indicators. When we often talk about the US and China, but and the EU, but India is very, very present, as are others in on specific indicators, specific domains. So this is also very important. And third and last, I mentioned earlier that organizations need tools to implement trustworthy AI. It's hard, it's complicated, it's technical, like tools to remove bias from AI systems or to test how secure a system is against attacks, as well as metrics to assess success or failure. But it's really hard for individual actors, particularly the smaller ones, to find the right tools for their needs. So we've been building a catalog of tools and metrics for trustworthy AI jointly with the US NIST, National Institute for Science and Technology, and with partners from all stakeholder groups. And here there are so many fantastic initiatives like documentation processes for data and models by technology players. UNESCO has a great AI training program for judges. Singapore has this AI governance testing framework and toolkit, and there are many, many, many others. There are thousands, in fact. So we'll launch this catalog of tools and metrics for trustworthy AI with NIST early in the new year. And those are some of the, I think, important initiatives just to facilitate implementation.
That's great. Thank you so much, Karine. And a lot of that is available online at oecd.ai. Marielza, we're running toward the end of our panel, but we very much like you to highlight some of the specific steps that UNESCO will be taking over the next year to move forward the AI recommendation. It's an exciting proposal, but of course, recommendations, typically we wait 4 years for reports. And I know you have a more ambitious plan, so maybe you could tell us what we can look forward to in the next year to operationalize, I finally got it right, operationalize the UNESCO recommendation on AI ethics.
Well, thank you very much. The operationalization is definitely a big element of that is actually capacity development, building the right capacities in the right actors so that really they can engage with the process of digital transformation that is AI driven in a sustainable, effective manner. So a big part of what we're doing is training the specific actors around the world. Karine mentioned the support we've been giving to judges, public prosecutors, magistrates, etc., through the justice sector training over the world in ways that they use, for example, artificial intelligence to deliver increased access to justice, reducing case backlogs and improving efficiency, etc. But they need to really understand how justice-oriented applications are developed in a responsible and ethical manner. So these are, some of the elements that that we need to put forward. So we've been training judges, for example, through our massive online course on AI and the rule of law, which I'm proud to say was designated as a solution for peace by this year's Paris Peace Forum. And we have recently completed the process of training 4,500 judicial actors from 138 countries on human rights and ethical implications of artificial intelligence. Another group that we've been training so that they can really move forward with an ethical approach to artificial intelligence is civil servants. Particularly those from ministries and digital units of government who have the challenge of leading digital transformation and addressing harnessing the opportunities, mitigating the risks of artificial intelligence. They really face a hard task because they need to master a new set of skills and competences that digital transformation processes that they plan and deploy are in line with an approach that is principles based on human rights, on openness, on accessibility, on multi-stakeholder participation, for example. So we developed a competency framework for civil servants on AI and digital transformation to empower this group in providing a basis for capacity development initiatives that are adapted to national needs, to tailored policymaker toolkits and workshops. So we're now developing a navigator tool to assess development, which we intend to have as a development ecosystem that includes self-assessment tools through which institutions and individual civil servants can understand where they are in their journey to master the necessary competences to produce ethical artificial intelligence. And that will be backed by online and offline training and knowledge exchanges to raise these competences, and digital planning and design, on data use and governance, on digital management and execution, and so on. So this is the exciting part that we have right now: building capacities, building awareness, and ensuring that we have civil servants and key decision makers ready to really uptake and employ artificial intelligence in when a human rights based approach ethical approach that upholds a human dignity and rights.
That's great. Thank you so much. I just wanted to take a quick moment to thank all of our panelists, but also to note how extraordinary it is at this moment in time. We're in the year 2022. 5 years ago, it wouldn't be possible to have such a panel because none of these initiatives were really underway at that time. And I suspect 5 years from now, a lot of the work we've done will be largely established. So we are in the moment where these frameworks are taking shape. I think we can learn from the frameworks, and I think we should continue to push forward. I'm not going to try that word again. I'll stay with implementation of these very important AI policy frameworks. So thank you all so very much. And back to you, Nico.
And thanks a lot, Marielza, Karine, and Jan. I think you have surfaced very eloquently the complementarity that should exist between the base of evidence, capacity, tools, and policies for any AI governance regime to be made effective beyond the legislative or the judicial intent. And I guess one of the reasons why we use at TFS at the core of our theory of change is operationalization model, and is to signify beyond implementation that to render something operational as an intent in terms of impact, we want to impact the behaviors of developers, deployers, investors, and regulators of AI systems. That's, I guess, why we're going the extra mile. But I take your word, implement is and rather effective is equally right. Thank you so much. And we are going to build upon this. And I think that we speak a lot about the Brussels effect. We should continue to speak about the Brussels effect, and we should also speak a little more about the Strasbourg effect and about the Paris effect with UNESCO and OECD, of course. Thank you so much.